Good evening, everyone. My name is Kristen Rich. I'm the Clay County 4-H and Agriculture Agent. Thank you for joining us. The Upper Cumberland Extension Team is made up of about 10 agents across the Upper Cumberland, and we have put together a series of Zoom meetings on various topics that happen one Tuesday out of the month. So be looking for more Ag Talk Tuesdays coming out from your extension offices. And this month is backyard poultry. So thank you guys for joining us. Before we get started, just make sure you're muted so there's no distraction or background noise. And we would also appreciate it if you do have questions to direct those to the chat box, and we will get to those at the end and answer those at the end. So I guess I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker for tonight. Our speaker is Dr. Kevin Downs. He received his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in Animal Science from the University of Florida and his PhD in Poultry Science from Auburn. Dr. Downs has taught undergraduate courses at MTSU since 2000 in poultry science, animal nutrition, and animal physiology. He coordinates the MTSU Poultry Science program. He is the advisor of the MTSU Poultry Science Club and coaches the MTSU Poultry Judging Team. So he's our poultry guru for tonight. Dr. Downs also conducts research in poultry nutrition. He likes giving students experience in poultry production and has worked with various youth development programs across Tennessee and many individuals just like you guys with their backyard flocks. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Downs, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Kristen. I appreciate the invitation a lot. Can I'm going to go ahead and, can I share my screen? Do I have permission to do that?
Yes, I believe so.
Go ahead, and it's fancy.
If not, let me know and we can get that going for you.
I think that should get it. Can you see that?
Yes, I can see that.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate the invitation to come and speak with you. When Kristen asked me, some ideas, or we discussed some ideas about what to talk about, the first thing that came to my mind was nutrition and health. And when I'm working with backyard producers, small scale producers, I tend to get a lot of questions, and these two things are the areas that I get the most questions about. And admittedly, these two areas are intimately tied together, and we'll talk some about that tonight. I love chickens, and I will try my best, Kristen, not to keep talking because I could talk hours about chickens, but I won't, because I don't want to bore too many of you. I wish obviously I could be there in person with you, and hopefully we can do this again another time and can be there and visit the Upper Cumberland, which I don't get to very often. By the way, before I go with that slide, if after we leave tonight, that's my email address. If anyone has any additional questions that you think of after the presentation today, and you didn't get a chance to ask a question, feel free to reach out to me by email. I try my best to reply, so don't hesitate if you have questions about that. And if any of you have kids, or any of you are high school kids interested in learning more about our poultry program here at MTSU, I'd encourage you to reach out as well. I'd love to have you come and visit and talk about our program and see some of what we do here. So I wanted to break this up into two segments, basically, talking about nutrition a little bit. And some of you, this stuff is probably old hat. Some of this stuff may be brand new for a lot of you if you're just kind of new into backyard poultry or small scale poultry production. And so I want to talk a little bit about nutrition. I am a nutritionist by training. Nutrition can be boring. A lot of people think it's boring. I'll try not to bore you when I talk about nutrition. And then I want to spend a little bit of time touching on bird health and disease control and things to assess about your operation relative to disease. Because like I said, most of the questions I get relate to nutrition and or relate to disease. And so those are two things I want to really focus about. Here's kind of what I wanted to talk about relative to nutrition. Briefly talk about important nutrients. A lot of us already know that based on what we eat. give you a sense of how to assess your bird's requirements. Because obviously some of us are raising maybe bantams, small birds. Maybe some of us are raising broilers. Maybe some of us just have a few birds, large layers for eggs. So we might have different types of birds, and obviously these birds have different nutrient requirements based on what their purpose is. And so we'll touch on that a little bit. Briefly talk about some feeds and feeding issues, look at some feed tags. And for those, again, for some of you, this is old hat, but some of you may not have paid a lot of attention to feed tags and how to read feed tags, and that's important. And then I briefly want to mention drugs, and that sounds bad to talk about drugs, but this is always something that comes up when we talk about feeding, well, a lot of things, but when we talk about feeding poultry, medicated feed versus not medicated feed, what does that mean? And so we'll touch on some of that as we go through. Easy stuff here. I think most of you already know this. What are nutrients that we concern ourselves with, whether it be us or whether it be a chicken? They're all the same. It doesn't matter. The most important nutrient obviously is water. And I'll reiterate some of that as well when we talk about water and its importance, particularly when we talk about providing the birds fresh water, clean water, all that kind of stuff. It's just common sense, but it's important, and it certainly affects the bird, the bird's performance, or whatever the purpose is for your bird. Protein, those things the birds use, those nutrients, the birds use to grow. Obviously, if they're they're chicks and you're growing them, they need a lot of protein. If they're layers, they need a lot of protein to make eggs, or the content of eggs. So protein is going to be one of your more important. Carbohydrates are those things that the bird makes energy from, basically. Carbohydrates, starches, primarily corn, for instance, has a lot of carbohydrates in it. Lipids are those fats and oils, and birds don't do well on a lot of fats and oils, but most poultry diets, or what birds consume, actually has some fats or oils in it. And obviously vitamins and minerals are important as well, and that's pretty obvious. But again, these things relate to what you consume in your daily diet as well. So I want to briefly mention bird requirements. When we talk about, and this is not just poultry, this could be really any animal. Obviously, we talk about egg production, we're kind of narrowing it down to poultry for our discussion. We think about an animal. All animals have what we term maintenance requirements. So that, and you do as well, really, that's the requirement that the animal has to maintain themselves, to maintain their body weight, to keep their heart beating, to maintain functionality of their organ systems, all that kind of stuff. So that's the most important thing. We got to keep the bird alive. That's the first thing. The bird, when the bird eats something, the first thing that bird needs to meet for its requirements is maintenance. It has to stay alive. If the bird is not getting enough nutrients to meet the maintenance requirements, is it going to grow? Is it going to produce eggs? No, because those are things that the birds do when they have their maintenance requirements met. Okay. So when we talk about chickens, we typically think of obviously maintenance requirement. We also talk about growth requirement and egg production requirements. So birds would have requirements for growth, but when would they have a requirement for growth? Not when they're, a 5-year-old hen. A 5-year-old hen does not have a requirement for growth because she's old. She's not growing anymore. If she's laying eggs, though, she has a requirement for egg production. Broilers have a huge requirement for growth because that's their job, is to grow. They have no requirement for egg production because they'll never reach the level for egg production, because we don't keep them that long. We kill them and eat them for meat. And so when we talk about chicks, even if you get chicks from a hatchery and black sex links, whatever type of bird you might have, you get them as chicks and you grow them. Even those birds, they're growing, they're going to have a lot of growth requirement at that point. And then obviously once they get older and start laying eggs, then that shifts from growth requirement to egg production requirement. Now, is there a time when a bird would have requirements for both growth and egg production? Yes, potentially, when you've got those pullets that are just now starting to lay that first egg. They're still growing, but now they're also making egg production, making eggs. And so that tends to be a time when they need a lot of nutrients in their diet. I like to think of, kind of feeding any animal really, but feeding backyard poultry, it's kind of a balancing act. We want to meet their requirements for nutrients, obviously, for whatever they're doing. If they're broilers and need a ton of nutrients, well, we better make sure that in that diet there is enough nutrients. If they're not, the birds are not going to grow. If we've got birds, their job is solely to lay eggs for us. And if we're not meeting their requirements for egg production in what we feed them, then they're not going to lay as many eggs. So it's not overly complicated, but if we want our birds to optimally do what they're supposed to do, egg production, growth, whatever, then we've got to meet those birds' requirements for those areas relative to the nutrients that they're consuming. Now, I'm going to turn my little, if I can get to it, my little handy dandy laser pointer on here. So when we talk about what birds, or we're talking about feeding backyard poultry, obviously you've got to define what you're actually feeding. Type of bird, age of bird, both those things could come into play. Are we feeding chicks? And obviously if you're growing broilers and you start out with this, what's on the screen are 2 broilers, but if you start with broilers and you grow those birds, you start out as chicks, you grow them, they have the highest demand for nutrients of any of our chickens because their job is to grow really fast and slaughter them to eat. But even if you're starting out with a small flock and you want to start out with all pullet chicks, they're still chicks. And so those chicks, because they're growing, are going to have a fairly high demand for nutrients. So we have to be aware of that. We have to understand what we're feeding, obviously. Are we feeding pullets or layers? Well, then we get into that whole egg production thing, because if a bird is producing eggs, then it's going to demand more nutrients. It's going to demand more, obviously, calcium for eggshell formation and all that stuff related to the egg itself. Are we feeding broilers? As I mentioned, broilers have a high requirement for protein because they're making a lot of muscle. Are we feeding turkeys or game birds? Different things there. Different types of feed, different requirements. These birds tend to have a higher requirement for nutrients, just kind of evolutionary because of what they are. And so turkeys, we tend to feed them at a higher level of nutrients. Same with game birds, the quail, the chuckers, whatever you're feeding as far as game birds. This is just a bunch of numbers. I don't want to bore you with a bunch of numbers, but this just gives you an idea of nutrient requirements for some example type birds. And here, this is some meat birds, the broilers or dual purpose type birds, but this shows you, and this just happens to be a layer type cross, pullets, the younger birds, the layers, the breeding birds, which some of you may be doing that, but you can see here, it gives you an idea of type of diets you might feed those birds. But I really want to key in on this is you'll see here's crude protein, or how much protein's in the diet. You'll notice, look what's happening. When they're chicks, when they're young, their protein requirement is fairly high, but as those birds get older and older, that changes and their protein requirement becomes a little bit less. But again, if we don't feed them enough protein, whether they're growing or producing eggs, then we're going to have, then the performance of those birds are going to obviously suffer. You can see the same thing when it comes to calcium here. Obviously, in the case of these egg producing birds, calcium levels in the diet should go up because what are they doing here? They're starting to lay eggs and produce a lot of calcium on those eggs. So they obviously need more calcium in their diet. This also shows you energy. Most of you are not going to get into all the stuff relative to nutrient requirements, at least the specifics of poultry, but certainly it's good to have an idea of, hey, I'm feeding chicks. I need to know that, because if I'm feeding a diet that contains, I don't know, maybe 14% crude protein to one-day-old chicks, is that going to be enough to meet their nutrient requirements? Probably not. Are they still going to grow? Maybe. Yeah, they'll grow, especially broilers, but are they going to grow at an optimal level for you to eventually make pullets or to reach market endpoint if you're growing broilers? So this just gives you a bit of an idea when it comes to that. I won't bore you with those numbers. Now, this is where I get into a little bit of, I get a little on my soapbox a little bit, I guess, relative to what are you going to feed? And again, some of you may be seasoned veterans and you have it down and you have your system of feeding birds and your birds do well, or you may have show birds and you have your system for conditioning those birds down pat. And I don't want to take anything away from that, but I want to particularly point out a few things to think about when you start to think about what you're going to actually feed your birds. And I do we're living in the world of emojis these days, and I couldn't resist, is to put these emojis here, and it's pretty simple. This is the poop emoji. I believe that's the right. Kristen, is that the correct term for that? I'm not. I hope that's right. Okay.
Yeah.
Poop emoji and poop emoji. Easy. If you feed the birds poop in their feed, not literally poop, but if you feed them crap, they're going to perform like crap. Easy, right? And that's okay. I mean, if you feed the birds a diet that doesn't meet their nutrient requirements, then they're not going to, it's simple science, they're not going to perform at their optimal level. If you feed them a diet and nothing but a diet that contains, say, I don't know, 7% protein, that's not very much. Are they going to grow well? No. Are they going to produce eggs well? No. Okay, that's just the reality of it. So you got to meet or attempt to meet the birds' requirements based on what you feed them. Now, I will point out, and I did this on purpose because I want to make a point of this concept right here. Chickens eat to meet their energy requirements. That's how they determine how much to eat. They don't determine how much to eat based on their protein in the diet. They determine how much to eat based on the energy in their diet. So if you are feeding a diet that has a lot of energy in it, that sounds good in theory, but in fact, it's not necessarily good in theory because the birds are going to eat to meet that energy requirement. That's what they're going to requirement they're going to attempt to meet. So if the diet you're feeding them has a lot of energy in it, they're not going to eat very much of it because it's so concentrated energy. It doesn't take them very long to fill up or to meet that energy requirement. They stop eating. And so that's going to, if their birds are not eating, they're not going to obviously consume enough nutrients, and that's going to affect the bird's performance. So question, what are you going to feed your birds? There are, and I was fascinated the other day, I really was. I mean, I'm a poultry nutritionist and I was still flabbergasted. I went into Tractor Supply the other day. I know the people there thought I was totally insane because I was taking pictures of chicken feed and I was counting and I was like, man, this is crazy. And it never dawned on me. Back in the day, many of you probably remember, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you went into a feed store and there may be 2 or 3 types of poultry feed. I counted 25 different distinct, now different brands doing the same thing, admittedly, but 25 distinct diets in Tractor Supply here in Murfreesboro. I was fascinated. Okay, some organics, some medicated, not medicated, different types for whatever bird. There are lots and lots, and I'm not going to obviously endorse any particular product or brand, but there are plenty of complete feeds out there that are specifically formulated to meet the bird's requirements for whatever type of bird you're feeding. If you're feeding chicks, there are starter diets out there. If you're feeding layers, there are layer diets out there. And those diets are specifically formulated to meet those birds' requirements for where they are at or what they're doing, okay? The problem I tend to see when people contact me about issues is I ask them what they're feeding and their answer automatically puts up a red flag for me because I'm like, that might be part of your problem. Because admittedly, birds don't, if given the choice, they don't necessarily want to eat this brown pellets or brown crumbles when they could eat this corn or these leaves of lettuce or this table scrap, whatever, because it's more appealing to them. But go back to what I said, they eat to meet their energy requirements, but these complete diets are designed to meet all of their nutrient requirements. So if I decide I want to, and this is a mistake a lot of people make, these 2 points right here, in my opinion, based on my experience, is, and there's nothing inherently wrong with doing this. I wouldn't recommend when it comes to kitchen scraps feeding meat, although chickens will eat meat. I would not recommend that because of just the disease issues or the bacterial issues. But a lot of people feed their birds kitchen scraps. A lot of them feed scratch, which scratch is a grain mix that you can buy fairly inexpensive. Birds love it. They love chicken scraps. Hey, I mean, when I had backyard birds a long time ago, it was always fun when we had a watermelon. We would cut the watermelon, eat it all out, and then give the watermelon rind to the chick. They loved it. But remember what I said, is they eat to meet their energy requirements. So if they're eating a watermelon that has a lot of sugar in it, they peck away at that. They're consuming a lot of sugar, and they now have met their energy requirement with that watermelon. Now what do they not want to do? They do not want to go over and eat that boring brown stuff. That's the complete feed. And so a lot of times when people are struggling with egg production issues, it's because they feed too much of this stuff. Because the bird, they feel like, well, that's cool to watch the birds. They like to scratch around and eat. It's okay every now and then for a little snack, but a lot of people use this as part of their diet of the birds. And the birds, they will still grow and they will still lay eggs. But if you want to maximize growth and maximize egg production, my recommendation would be to find a really good, don't have to break the bank, but find a really good complete feed and provide only that to your birds. That's my recommendation based on what, I get a lot of comments about when it comes to what you're going to feed. Some people, and not many probably, but some people mix their own feeds, and that's okay too. It's probably a little bit more expensive, but there are some home mix recipes out there. And then this is a big issue that I do get some questions about from time to time, is I want to feed organic feed. Perfectly fine. Lots of organic products out there, complete feed out, organic or complete organic feeds out there. Very good, a little more expensive, obviously. If you are going to, if you're selling eggs and you're calling them organic, or you just want to raise your birds organically, that's certainly fine. There's plenty of options out there for you to feed. It's going to cost you more, and you have to address the issues. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but you're going to have to address the issues when it comes to how do you deal with the fact these feeds have no drugs in them, because obviously organic would be antithesis to drugs in the feed, and we'll talk some about that as we go through. I do this with my students a lot, or when I'm talking to 4-H kids or whatever, and this goes back to what I was talking about with the whole eating to meet their energy requirements. What's your preference? If I ask you, literally me sitting here looking at those Brussels sprouts makes me want to puke. I want the chocolate cake. Now, some of you may be crazy, and that's okay. Some of you may be crazy. You're like, oh, I love Brussels sprouts way more than I do chocolate cake. I don't know about you if that's the case, but hey, that's okay. You're healthier than I am. I want the chocolate cake. Well, so do the chickens, not the chocolate cake per se, but they want the scratch, or they want the table scraps. And so they're going to eat a lot of that. If I only ate chocolate cake all the time, would I be very healthy? No. Now you could say, well, Brussels sprouts don't have everything. That's true, but we know Brussels sprouts are healthier than chocolate cake, but we want the chocolate cake because it tastes better. And so that's the same concept when we talk about poultry. So think about that as you're feeding your bird. It's okay to give them snacks, that type of stuff, but don't overdo it, because remember, they're going to eat a lot of that because they enjoy it, and they eat to meet their energy requirements. So once you meet those requirements for energy, they're going to shut off and they're going to stop eating. They don't need them anymore, but they may have met their energy requirements by eating a high energy diet like scratch or table scraps, and not consumed enough protein in that, and that thereby you're going to suffer on growth or egg production. I want to briefly, I'm not going to bore you with this, I want to briefly show you, these are some pictures I just took in Tractor Supply of some tags, some feed tags. Most of you know how to read feed tags, but let's talk about it anyway. I want to point out a few things. All feed tags will share kind of a commonality. So you've got the ingredients, no big deal there. You see what's in it. You certainly, I would encourage you to look at that, what's in your poultry feed you're buying. There's a lot of terms in here that are very generic. And I admit that it's like, I don't know what processed grain byproducts mean. How many of you know what that means? Most of us probably don't. I happen to know that is dried distillers grains most likely, because it's very common these days. But these companies are able to get away with, and they're not hiding anything that's allowed by law, but they can put descriptors in there for ingredients that are a little bit less specific, and you really don't know what that means. Whole corn, we know what that means. Soybean meal, we know what that means. Roughage products, we don't really know what that means. Forage products, probably something like alfalfa meal or whatever. And a bunch of vitamins, minerals, maybe some amino acids, some other stuff. Some of the more expensive diets you buy, they'll have a bunch of this stuff down here, which some of it's perfectly fine. Some of it might be overkill, like marigold petals, marigold meal. That'll make your egg yolks darker in color, but this is a starter grower. Why do we really care about that if you're talking about growing birds? But that's neither here nor there. And so there's some stuff in here, some fermentation products, like basically like probiotics, us eating yogurt, that kind of stuff. We've added some of that as well. So this ingredients here, you can see it over here as well. Ingredients also. Guaranteed analysis. So that's what's in the feed, guaranteed to be by law. So you can see the minimum in this starter grower was 18%. And then you can see lysine, that's methionine, it's a couple of amino acids, gives you values there, fat, fiber. So you can see, kind of gives you an idea of what's in the diet. And we typically key in on the protein when we assess, and that's not wrong to do. Everybody does that. You look, hey, this 18% protein, well, that's a starter grower. Okay, well, if I'm feeding, let's say, for instance, I wanted to use this diet to feed broilers, is that enough? No, not really. So I need to potentially look at a diet that has a little bit more protein, or maybe I want to grow some pullet chicks and I don't want to feed them 18, I want to feed them 22%. And that's perfectly fine. There are diets out there for that as well. But again, these are complete diets, and that's a good thing. Feeding directions, take that with a grain of salt. Obviously these companies want you to use a lot of their products, so they're going to encourage you to feed a lot of their feed. But for the most part, birds that we have in backyard flocks or small flocks, for the most part, we can feed them pretty much all they want, because they're not going to grow too fast or get too fat. They just don't have the genetics for that. Broilers are a different ball game a little bit when it comes to that. You do have to kind of control them a little bit on the front end. One thing I want to point out too, and this is maybe one thing that we miss the most when it comes to feed we buy in the store, is the date of the feed. Now that May the 12th is when this bag of feed was made. And you're like, why does date matter? Well, it's like expiration date. And I've had stores tell me before. I went in and there was a bag of feed one time. I remember it was 6 months old in the store on the shelf. And I'm like, do you have anything fresher? And he's like, well, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm like, yeah, there is. Feed that's 6 months old, obviously that's problematic, because a lot of these vitamins and especially the minerals are inorganic. They oxidize things. So as it's sitting there all mixed together, it will oxidize the other stuff in there, especially the vitamins. And so what you see in older feed is the vitamins level actually goes down the longer it sits, because those vitamins are being oxidized. So that's a problem. And so be aware of your feed, make sure it's not too old. And you can always find that on the label or on the bag somewhere when it was manufactured. As a rule of thumb, I usually say about 3 months or less is ideal. And I would always encourage you to ask if your feed, the person or the company you get your feed from, the feed they're offering for sale is old. I would certainly encourage you to ask, do they have any fresher feed, or can they get you fresher feed? This shows you same thing. This happens to be scratch. You can see here, same thing relative to the feed tag, but I do want to point out, here's the scratch issue. You'll note, and a lot of people like scratch. It's cheap, but look what's in it. It's cracked corn. This has to be organic scratch. Cracked corn, wheat, and barley. Those are all energy feeds. They have a lot of starch in them. And notice it's low in protein, low in fat. This doesn't actually show you a carbohydrate or a starch level, but I can tell you, obviously, these are kind of the cereal grains. They have a lot of starch in them. And so if you feed the birds a lot of this, they like it, they eat a lot of it, but they're not getting enough protein to meet their requirements for growth or egg production in just consuming scratch. A lot of people like to mix this 50-50. Well, remember, if you do that, you're diluting out the nutrients in the complete feed you're mixing it with. Thereby, the birds are not getting as much nutrient intake, because you're diluting a lot of, especially the protein out. You're diluting it out with a lot of a lot of the energy portion that's in the scratch. A couple more questions, and trying to watch my clock a little bit. I don't want to bore you to death and keep going and going. But a couple more questions I get a lot is, do birds need grit, and do your birds need oyster stones? Now, grit, if you're not familiar with what grit is little pebbles that in nature a wild bird would stop and pick up some little small pebbles. And those pebbles, that's why I put this diagram of the digestive tract. This is the gizzard here. And the gizzard is designed to grab a hold of those little pellets or those little pebbles and hold on to them. And so inside the gizzard, it's like a sandpaper, because the job of the gizzard is to grind. And by eating that grit, it increases the efficiency of that grinding action. Very important in wild birds, because what do wild birds eat? Or at least the ones we're most familiar with, obviously a hawk or an eagle, they're going to eat meat, different thing altogether. Their gizzard is not very functional, but the typical songbird, where they eat lots of seeds and things like that, whole. And so they need that extra help from that grit in that gizzard to grind. If you're feeding, which I'm certainly not recommending, but if the only thing you feed your chicken is scratch, again, whole or a cracked grain, they're going to need grit. Now, where do they get grit? In most cases, they'll pick up little pebbles in the dirt if they're able to have access to dirt. You can buy grit for them. Again, I don't recommend feeding scratch, and I don't recommend a need for grit. Why? Because if you go to wherever and you buy a complete feed, it's in two forms. It is most likely in a pellet or a crumble, and crumble is taking the pellet and busting it up for the chicks, but that diet's already ground. So the bird doesn't need grit to be able to efficiently grind, because they don't need the help, because the diet itself is already ground. So the grit issue is unimportant. Now, if you've got a songbird in a cage or a parakeet or whatever, you're feeding them a whole seed diet, they certainly need grit. You can buy that for them. They need oyster shells. Now, oyster shells, as its name implies, comes from oyster shells. It's a source of calcium. Nothing wrong with feeding that. Birds, if you're feeding a good layered diet, probably don't need it. If it makes you feel better, it's fairly inexpensive to supplement it. The birds, they will eat it. If you do run into issues with shell strength, where you're starting to get some shells that have thin spots or shellless eggs, the first thing I would probably try first is to check your diet and make sure you're feeding the right type of diet. Second of all, you could add some sort of calcium supplement, like oyster shell. Oyster shell is pretty inexpensive, but that's a calcium supplement. That would be kind of up to you whether you want to do that or not. A couple more things, just some common sense things I wanted to mention. A lot of this stuff you already know, but I want to kind of drill it in a little bit, because this is some important things to keep in mind. Obviously, you need to provide your birds with clean water, fresh water, cool water in days like this are important. It's very hot. I don't know what it is Upper Cumberland area, but here in Murfreesboro, it was over 100 degrees today, I think, heat index. Birds do well in heat, but having a source of cool water, if you can, or changing their water to provide some cool water, certainly helps them to be able to regulate their body temperature. So I'd encourage that. Water is the most important nutrient the birds can consume. If they are not consuming enough water, what's the first thing that's going to suffer? Feed intake. And so if water consumption, if you're not providing your birds with fresh water or water that is of good quality, then their feed consumption may start to go down. You're like, why are they not eating? Well, it could be because of your water, because birds do, on a weight basis, they drink twice as much water as they eat. And so water is important. Make sure your feed's fresh. I already talked about that. If you're buying feed, make sure it's fresh. Obviously, don't feed moldy feed. That's a whole issue. Chickens are very sensitive to some of these toxins that can build up by these molds. I think that's right. The toxins that can build up can kill the birds. They certainly can cause a lot of disease issues, or a lot of pathological issues, but certainly if it's bad enough, it can kill the bird. So make sure, don't feed moldy feed, or even if feed has, just a little bit of mold in it and you just take it out. I don't even know if I'd do that, because these birds, some of these toxins are very, very, birds are sensitive at a very, very low level. So I would discourage any type of mold. Rodents, obviously, make sure you store your feed away from rodents. Rodents are a big vector for disease for you, for birds, for other animals. So obviously keep the feed away from rodents. And the last point on here, and this may be one you need to reassess if you have issues. And I would say the same for drinkers as well. Make sure your birds have enough space. If there's not enough space for them to eat, your little flock to eat, then what's going to happen? It's going to cause issues of birds, especially the dominant birds, beating up on the more timid birds because they're fighting over feeder space. So if you're having issues, and it's not always about this, but if you're having issues with feather pecking, first thing I would assess, do I have enough feeder space and drinker space for my birds so that when they're eating and drinking, they're not fighting, and the more aggressive birds are beating up on the small birds, because that tends to be what we see happening. One last point I'll make it on the nutrition side, and then we'll kind of move over to health. And I know I'm touching the surface on a lot of this. I encourage you to ask questions. I don't know all the answers, but if after we leave today, if you have other things, questions you want to ask, again, I encourage you to email me, because you want to kind of touch the surface on this. I teach whole classes on these different subject matters, so we're kind of touching the big points tonight. The thing that's changed a lot in this whole concept of drugs and feed, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, you could go to the feed store or whatever, and you could buy medicated feed. And that medicated feed then was medicated with two different things typically. It was medicated with antibiotic in the feed, and it was also medicated with what we call a coccidiostat. Now, the antibiotic issue, the government's pretty much taking care of that for us. It is no longer allowed to add antibiotics to poultry feeds any longer. So you won't find medicated feeds in the store that are medicated with antibiotics, because it's actually, is there the whole concept of, is there residue? And I won't get in that argument tonight, because I have my own opinions of that, but residues in chicken meat or eggs causing antibiotic resistance in humans, that whole thing. So a few years back, everyone had to remove their antibiotics from their feed, and so you no longer find that. Now, if you're feeding an organic diet, you can't feed a diet that has any medication in it. So that becomes a challenge, because the medicated feed you still can find today is medicated with a coccidiostat. Coccidiostat is not an antibiotic. A coccidiostat is a drug that's designed to, and some of you may be familiar with this disease, we'll talk in a second about it, but coccidia, it's a little protozoa that lives in the bird's gut, and it attacks the bird's gut, and it's certainly in young birds to kill them very quickly. But the concept is eventually birds being exposed to a little bit of coccidia in their environment, they become immune to it or resistant to it, and then older birds, they're resistant to it. So by using this coccidiostats in there, what that does is that doesn't kill coccidia, it just reduces the population so we don't have too many in the bird's gut to really hurt the bird, but we have a few coccidia there so the birds can develop, kind of like a vaccine. The birds can develop a little bit of immunity to the coccidia, and then as they get older, they're immune or resistant to coccidia, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. So usually when you see coccidiostats, they're used in starter grower type diets for younger birds. Again, if you're in organic production, that's going to become an issue, because then you have to address coccidia control outside the scope of the diet. And that's where making sure your environment is very clean and dry, particularly in summertime, because that's when coccidia like to grow in the environment and birds pick them up. And there we go, especially young birds. So it can become a big challenge when it comes to that. All right. So again, feel free, we'll come back at the end and try to answer your questions, but feel free to asking questions in the chat relative to nutrition. I want to move briefly so I don't run out of time. I already see I don't have a whole lot of time, so I'll try and move through this fairly quickly. Talk a little bit about disease issues. I'm not going to bore you with the actual specifics of the disease in the birds, because there are many, and most of them really don't affect backyard birds to any large extent. These are some of the diseases that you might run into, hopefully not, but these are some of the more common diseases we find in backyard flocks. Now, you're like, oh, avian influenza, that's terrible. It is terrible, and it gets a lot of press, because avian influenza gets into large commercial flocks, and we have to depopulate those flocks, lose a lot of money. Avian influenza is pretty common in backyard flocks, but the birds, because we don't raise those birds in intensive environments, the birds tend to be carriers, and they just kind of, it hangs out in the bird that really doesn't affect them. And so it's not uncommon to have avian influenza in the backyard, in some backyard flocks. MG, Mycoplasma gallisepticum, that's also pretty common in backyard flocks. Some of these you would have in maybe your backyard flock, but the birds don't show any signs of them, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, unless you have an outbreak caused by stress or anything like that. Infectious bronchitis, pretty common as well. LT or laryngotracheitis, it's obviously a disease that affects their trachea, their larynx, part of the respiratory system. These are not uncommon in backyard flocks. All of these diseases are respiratory in nature. Most of the time when we have disease issues in backyard flock, it's mostly respiratory. if you see your birds or, a few of your birds starting showing similar signs, oftentimes maybe they're fluffed up in the corner somewhere and they're having a hard time breathing, and maybe they got kind of snotty stuff running out of their nostrils, they look in their mouth, or they're running eyes, whatever, that's a respiratory disease. And that's fairly common in backyard flocks. But sometimes those are not necessarily these 4 guys up here. Sometimes they're just kind of what we call systemic bacterial infection. So a bacteria of some sort, or more than one, gets in the bird and it attacks your respiratory system, kind of like you having some sort of a cold or something like that. And the birds may get over it without any problem. But we'll talk in a minute about assessing the environment and trying to help you kind of control some of those issues. Marek's and foulpox are not respiratory. These are 2 diseases that we might run into in backyard flocks. Again, there are many, many poultry diseases out there. These are some of the more common ones. Now, Marek's, if you're buying your chicks from a hatchery and you can request for them to be vaccinated for Marek's, when they're, well, in the case of those, they tend to have, or they vaccinate them when they're chicks, but in the industry, we vaccinate for Marek's inside the egg before the bird hatches. But you can vaccinate for birds. You can pay for, typically these hatcheries, you can pay for Marek's vaccines for each of your birds, and that's perfectly fine. This is basically a viral cancer, and so it's pretty nasty disease. So the vaccines are available. Foulpox, there's also a vaccine for foulpox as well. We don't typically vaccinate commercial birds for foulpox, but we certainly do, or have the option to do that for backyard birds. Foulpox is spread by mosquitoes. That tends to be why we see that in a lot of backyard birds, because of obviously mosquito population. There are vaccines for a lot of these. You're like, well, why can't I vaccinate my backyard flock for these? You certainly can for many of these. Here's the problem. And this has not been addressed by the companies, and I don't know that it will, because the companies are making most of their money off of selling vaccines to large companies that are vaccinating thousands and thousands of birds at one time. If you've got 10 hens and you want to vaccinate them, you can get vaccines. But most of the time, you're going to get vaccines that are designed to vaccinate 500 to 1,000 birds. So you're buying a dose of vaccine or a vial of vaccine that's designed for a whole lot of birds. You can certainly do that. You can buy them, Valley Vet Supply, Jeffers Pets, all that kind of stuff, those companies like that. You can buy it, but it tends to be a little pricey. And a lot of times, you're either going to share it. Maybe you have a friend that also has backyard flock you could share that with, assuming you handle it correctly. You can share that vaccine with, that'll help, or you can just pay it and throw the rest of it away. It seems like a big waste, but the companies have not, and they, like I said before, they won't probably ever get to the level where they're producing, vials of vaccine that's like 10 doses or something. So these tend to be really many, many doses in one vial. So that tends to be a little bit cost prohibitive for backyard flocks. So we tend to talk about disease control more relative to how we manage the birds, biosecurity, all that kind of stuff. I did want to mention this, I couldn't resist. I saw this and some time back, and I'm like, I think I heard it on the news. I'm like, wow, really? That wasn't, I like chickens, but I don't like them this much. Seriously, I've never had chickens for pets. Some people, apparently chickens are a big deal for pets now. This is more of a human health thing, but I certainly would discourage you from kissing or hugging chickens, especially children, because they do naturally have salmonella. That's just part of what's in the bird's gut. It's supposed to be there. At high levels, not so much, but it's there. So just be aware as we start to think about kids around poultry, be aware of that. A little bit on external parasites. These are a fairly significant issue in the South. Good news is easy to control most of these guys. This is great for supper time to show you. This is a northern fowl mite, which is fairly common in chickens. This is a fairly small bug. It's about a millimeter, which is kind of small. You can see it if you have really good eyesight. My eyesight's not that good. This is a louse. Okay, this is a poultry louse, lice, plural. You can see these guys crawling around on your bird. Where do you look for these guys? And these are the 2 most problematic things we'll have in backyard poultry. Take the bird, flip a bird over, and right around that vent area, peel some of the feathers back a little bit and look. If you've got a big infestation, you'll see these bugs crawling all over the birds. You'll also see black at the base of the feathers. That's basically poop from these guys that build up there. If it gets really, really bad and you have egg layers, you will see these guys crawling on your eggs, which means the mites are on the bird and in the environment. That's the key here when we talk about all of these external parasite guys, except for maybe mosquitoes, is you've got to, and this is when I had an email the other day from somebody, and I was like, first question I asked the person was, I believe they're having a mite issue, if I remember correctly. And the first thing I asked, have you treated both the bird and the environment at the same time? If you just treat the bird and you don't treat their environment, meaning their coop or whatever they're staying in or living in, then you're kind of defeating the purpose of it. And vice versa, if you just treat the environment, not bird, same thing, because the bird is obviously the host, but they will move around their environment on and off the birds. So good news is there's a lot of products out there. There are dips you can buy, and you can dip your birds. You're thinking that sounds like a lot of work. It is if you have 150 birds, but if you got 10 birds, dipping the birds, it's fairly easy. The birds do very well at that. You wouldn't want to do it in the wintertime, obviously, but birds do very well, and dips work very well. You can also use dust. You can use sprays. But again, you've got to treat the housing or the environment and the bird at the same time, and probably follow up 3 weeks later with another dose to make sure you've destroyed any little guys that have popped out of the eggs. Fleas and ticks, we don't tend to have a ton of problems with those when it comes to backyard poultry. They can obviously affect your birds. There are products you can actually use, some off-label stuff that we use on cats to treat some of this with backyard poultry. Indeed, with mites and lice, you can use some off-label stuff with ivermectin for cattle and that kind of stuff. Anybody wants more information on that, you can certainly contact me. I don't like to administer off-label use, but there is some stuff out there that's very safe for the bird that you can use that is off-label. It works very well. I've used it for years and years to control external parasites and internal parasites. Very easy to control. So be aware of that. Lots of products out there. These things are not that hard to control. Mosquitoes, that's part of the environment. They can spread fowl pox, so you have to be kind of aware of that. Another great thing to show at dinner time, this is roundworms here, and this little egg-looking things are actually coccidia cysts or oocysts. These are what the bird would pick up from the environment. Worms, there's a lot of different types of worms. The worms can be controlled. There's lots of types of wormers out there too you can use for poultry. They work very, very well. Easy to worm the birds. How do you know your birds have got worms? Well, the easiest way is to look at their poop. If you see little white, maybe they always say it's kind of the size of rice when we're talking about dog poop and tapeworms, but it kind of similar, but they're tapered on both ends. If you see that in your bird's poop, that's probably roundworms. Now, if you start to see worms that are this size in the bird's poop, and I've seen birds like that with worms that size, that's a serious infestation of roundworms. So you need to treat those birds, because obviously the birds, if they have roundworms like this, it's going to affect the bird's performance and their health. And you're going to see birds that are a little lethargic. Their feather coat is kind of nasty looking. It's not nice and smooth. And so, but good news is worms are fairly easy to treat with birds, but you need to have a worming program, and you'll need to repeat those treatments, as a general rule of thumb, about every 3 months is a good rule of thumb, or at least one application of dewormer and then 3 months later another, and that'll at least get you to a point where you get your worm infestation under control. Coccidia is another story. Coccidia is much more dangerous to the bird, especially young birds, is when we see coccidia. These are the things I talked about, that they kind of destroy their gut, cause bloody diarrhea, not just in chickens. They affect cattle, and goats, and sheep, and dogs, and cats. Coccidia can affect humans as well, causing bloody diarrhea because the digestive tract is being eaten by these little guys. And so how do we control that? Well, we can feed a coccidiostat in their diet, and that certainly works well to keep them under control. However, if you're on an organic system, that becomes more of a challenge, because these guys love to grow in moist environments that are very hot. Guess what we're in right now? We live in that, but we're in a moist, hot environment. If inside of your coop it stays moist and hot all the time, and you've got young birds, there's a good chance, because they're going to pick them up from the environment, from the ground. There's a good chance around here they're going to pick up coccidia. They may survive without a problem, but these young birds, I had some birds one time and they got coccidia, and it affected them greatly. And fortunately I didn't lose any because I was so aggressive with treatment. And there are some treatments you can buy out there for coccidia in the water and that kind of stuff. So I kind of saved those birds, but it's a rough disease, very painful for the birds. The birds have coccidia. They're kind of roughed up, very lethargic, have diarrhea, oftentimes blood in that diarrhea. So you want to avoid that. Keeping the coop very dry and clean is a big way to help with coccidia as well. Speaking of that, I want to just stress a couple of things to you as we think about disease control. If you've had disease outbreaks and you're like, I'm struggling a little bit controlling it, I want you to think about these three things. Assess your housing and the environment. Are there too many birds in your coop or your housing environment, whatever you got? Is it a moist environment? Is it a dry environment? It's very dusty, that kind of stuff. Because if you have too many birds in a moist environment, that is perfect for growth of disease, especially coccidia, but other diseases as well, easily spread. So be aware of that. Along those same lines, if you have not enough feeder space, not enough water space, all that's causing bird stress. As well as I do, if the birds become stressed, if you become stressed, your immune system becomes less powerful, same with the birds, and so they're more likely to get some diseases. So be aware of the bird's stress level, because they certainly can affect their disease. In commercial poultry, which I work with a lot, we want to try our best to minimize stress, because we know birds that are stressed are not going to perform optimally, and they have the potential for disease. And along those same lines, and this is where we tie in diet, is if a bird is not consuming enough of the right nutrients for what it is designed to do, then that's setting up a potential for disease, because obviously the correct amount of the nutrients the bird needs is going to help that bird's immune system be able to fight off many of these diseases we run into. So just some things, some food for thought there as you talk about disease control. One last thing I want to mention, I'm about out of time, is biosecurity. Now, you've probably heard lots of people talk about biosecurity, and I will be one more person to talk about it because it's very, very important. In the industry that I work in with commercial poultry production, biosecurity is critically important. Now, you're not going to likely enact biosecurity procedures that we have in some areas of the poultry industry, where you have to take a shower when you go in and a shower when you go out. If people that came over to your house and wanted to look at your chickens, if you made them take a shower, I thought it'd be cool if you did that. It'd be hilarious. But if you said, you got to take a shower before you go see my birds, and then when you leave, you got to take another shower, that's biosecurity. Okay. Because why would we do that? Because that person visiting your operation or your farm or your flock, they potentially can bring disease, especially if they have other birds. And so you got to be aware of that. So biosecurity is important. Other poultry can be what we call vectors, those things that allow us to transmit the disease. Other poultry, wild birds, that tends to be a problem. So control your wild bird population. Don't let your birds have access to a lot of wild birds that are around them if you can avoid it. Rodents, obviously I mentioned that. Other mammals, we have a big problem with that around here. Raccoons, possums, you name it down the list, fox, they can all transmit or be vectors of transmission. If you want to learn more about biosecurity, I would encourage you, Google USDA Defend the Flock. They have a really cool biosecurity program for backyard flocks. So I'd encourage you to visit that and learn more about how you might be able to enact. You don't have to go crazy, but doing any little thing with biosecurity would be helpful. Now, if you're somebody that shows your birds, whether you're a big time poultry show person, or you're just showing at, say, the county fair, that becomes more of a challenge because your birds are going to be commingled. Now, if you really want to go all out, take your birds to the fair or the show, come back and have a designated area away from your other birds that you can quarantine them for a couple of weeks. That's not always easy for everybody to do. So we always have to take kind of things with a grain of salt. We have to balance reality with trying our best to control disease flow that might be coming into our flock. One last thing I want to mention, because there is a lot of good material out there. I'm part of this group as well. This is a consortium of extension professionals around the country, and we've come together to put out material in a lot of different areas, but this happens to be our poultry page. So you can certainly visit this website, extension.org, poultry.extension.org, and that's the specific backyard poultry group. And there's a lot of resources on there related to management of backyard birds, disease, nutrition, basic poultry science type stuff. So I'd encourage you to visit those websites. I am pretty much out of time, probably went over my time. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Like I said before, I would encourage you to, after we're done tonight, if things come up, it's like, hey, I just saw this in my flock 2 days from now, shoot me an email. I may not have an answer for you, but maybe I can get you to somebody or give you some resources that might help you a little bit in the situation you have. So I'm happy to answer any question. Again, I appreciate the invitation. I hope you picked up a little bit of information from what we talked about tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Downs. We really appreciate you being on here tonight to share your wealth of knowledge with us. So let's get to the chat box. I see lots of "this is helpful. Thank you for teaching us," and more thank yous. And then we have one that says, oh, my chat's going nuts. Hold on just a second.
I see somebody saying, I'm moving away from my HOA. I understand that.
Yeah. Can we, Wayne? Yes. This is recorded, so it can be shared on Facebook or it's going to be, I think it's going to be on YouTube, I think. So does anybody else have any questions? Because we didn't have any specific questions in the comments, but please feel free to unmute yourself. There's just a few of us on here, so if you have any questions, shoot them to Dr. Downs or shoot them in the chat box. Either way.
I have a quick question just about like purchasing from other small small farm operations.
Right.
Is there anything that you should look for or ask when you're purchasing eggs from like friends or neighbors, for example?
Now, when you talk about purchasing eggs, are you talking about eggs for consumption or eggs for hatching?
Consumption.
From consumption. Not necessarily. I would, you're talking about potentially biosecurity issues. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, or just anything like as far as like the health of the eggs for eating or possible, salmonella or anything like that.
Right. No, that's a good question. I not necessarily anything specifically, although I would be curious if I were to ask that person a question or some questions about the eggs. I would like to know what the birds are eating, just because keep in mind that birds, not just chickens, birds in general, a lot of what they eat winds up in the yolk, for good or bad. It winds up in the yolk. And so if those birds have access to a nice complete feed, then those nutrients, at least part and part, are going to go in the yolk, and that, but if those birds, this sounds scary, but if those birds have access to literal pile of crap, I mean, like they can go and, scratch around and eat other animals' crap, and there's a potential for, yes, those nutrients to wind up in the yolk, but it's not like you're eating crap in the yolk. They're going to kind of quote unquote filter that, but there's the potential for consumption of salmonella that can be deposited, because yolks of eggs do have salmonella. We just don't want that salmonella level to be too high, where it could, if we don't cook that egg all the way, it could affect our health. So I would ask first what they're feeding their birds, or what do the birds have access to. From a biosecurity standpoint, I would, and this sounds really nitpicky. That's just kind of the way I am. But if you have your own birds, I've seen this before. That's what I've literally seen it. If you get eggs from somebody and they have a mite infestation, and you get eggs and you bring eggs back, and say you put those eggs in your refrigerator, but in the doing from their place to your place, those mites got off of that egg flat or whether they're in, and they start crawling on you, and then you go check your birds. Those mites don't affect you, but they will jump off of you onto your birds. I've seen it before where somebody had a real bad infestation of mites and they were on the eggs, but those birds, if you sit an egg in a carton, those mites with a light, they want to run away from the egg. They want to get away where it's darker. So they're going to run to the bottom of that flat. If you were to move the eggs around. So the point is that flat itself can have mites on it. Now, this would have to be a pretty severe infestation. But so theoretically, you could transmit mites or lice for that matter. Lice are easier to see than mites, but you can transmit them to your own birds. So from a biosecurity standpoint, that's a problem. Now, beyond that, if we get really nitpicky, can disease be transmitted? Not mites, not lice, but actual disease be transmitted from an egg flat from this person's farm to your farm or your operation? Absolutely. So be aware of that. You know, you can do certain things when you get that flat of eggs you buy from your neighbor or whatever, and take them out of that flat, throw that flat away if you're able to burn that flat, whatever, but get rid of that flat of eggs, wash your hands, sanitize, all that kind of stuff, because there is the potential for disease to be transmitted from that other farm or that other flock to your flock just in those eggs. So you have to be aware of that. Obviously, if you went over to that farm and came straight back to your birds, you would be a vector of transmission. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
Sorry, I was muted. We have 2 more questions in the chat.
Sure.
Right here, someone says, first, we've been feeding our chickens large amounts of Japanese beetles. Is that recommended?
Well, there's another problem, and that goes back to what I was saying with birds eating to meet their need. Now, the one thing about eating, but I'm not encouraging chickens will eat bugs. That's natural. Chickens are omnivores. They eat animals and plants, so that's totally natural for the birds to enjoy Japanese beetles. I would not get carried away with it because there is a potential for disease transmission. Those beetles can transmit disease. We run into these issues not with Japanese beetles, but with another type of beetle in the industry that will infest houses, and they will transmit disease from one farm to the other. So be aware from that. Be aware of that from a disease transmission standpoint. That those Japanese beetles, who knows, they could be coming from another flock down the road to your house, and you're feeding your birds. So it could be a disease transmission. The other issue from a pure nutrition standpoint, not as bad, but not as bad as feeding just solely scratch, for instance. But those beetles have a lot of fat in them, and fat is energy. And so what's going to happen again is the birds are going to eat a lot of that, and they're not eating starch, they're eating fat, and fat is energy. And like I said before, birds are going to eat to meet their energy requirements. So they're going to eat a little bit of those beetles and probably have met their energy requirement because that fat in them is so concentrated. And the good thing about the Japanese beetles or other bugs is, in addition to the fat, they also have some protein in them. So that kind of balances that a little bit. It's not a problem to do that. I just wouldn't get carried away with it. I'd probably just give it to them as snacks. In my personal opinion, if I was going to choose, I sound like an awful advocate against scratch, and it's not a bad thing. It's not going to hurt the birds, but I've just seen what it does from the standpoint of a negative effect of feeding solely scratch or mixing scratch with the feed to what it does to birds' performance. Birds don't lay as many eggs, don't grow as much. So the Japanese beetle thing is, I would feel better doing that than feeding a lot of scratch, just from the standpoint of meeting the birds' nutrient requirements, certainly. But I would encourage you, just from a disease standpoint, I'd encourage you probably to not do a lot of that, because there is a lot of potential there for some disease transmission, especially if you live close to other poultry. But even in that, even with wild birds. So just be aware of that.
All right. And the next question is, what is a good way to stop extreme aggression when it comes to a flock's pecking order?
Yeah. That's a good question. That's a tough question to answer. That's a question I get an awful lot. It's a challenge, because what will happen, the way things should work is you get birds, and they didn't maybe grow up together, and you put them together, and they're going to establish an order. That's the way birds do. That's the way chickens do. They establish a pecking order. That's the way it should work. You got a dominant bird, you got submissive bird or birds. That's just the way it should work. Sometimes, however, and that should settle itself out, and those birds should get along. Yes, there'll be a dominant female that'll say, hey, I'm in charge. Or just go peck the timid bird just to make sure that timid bird knows. That's normal. But you oftentimes will get aggression where it's almost as if there is no pecking order ever been established, so you're constantly establishing a pecking order. Now, you have to be aware, are you introducing any new birds? Even one. That's, if you introduce just one new bird, that screws up everything. They start the process over again as far as establishing pecking order. So you have to be aware, are you introducing new birds? If not, then the question, do your birds have enough, as I mentioned before, do they have enough feeder space? Do they have enough drinker space? Do they have enough space in their actual living area? Do they have enough roosting space? If you provide your birds roost, do they have enough roosting space? You want to try to do things, you have to think like a bird. And chickens are not bright animals. They have a tiny brain and big eyes. They're dumb, but they're very much creatures of habit. So you have to think like them. And it's like, okay, hey, they're fighting all the time. Well, maybe this fight started because there's not enough roosting space, or there's not enough feeder space. So I'd say reassess all that. Make sure birds have enough space. They need space. If you're not giving the birds enough space, feeder space, housing space, roosting, or whatever, you could see some issues with that don't resolve because they're always under a state of stress, because they're always like, you're too close to me. I'm gonna beat you up. Too close, too close, too close. So reassess that. If that doesn't solve the issue, then this is where people don't really want to hear me say this, but this is usually what will happen. Instead of adding birds, subtract a bird. So if you find a bird that you identify, you have to observe them, watch them, put a little wildlife camera on them, whatever, and watch them. Identify that very dominant female, assuming you've got females. And then if she's the one that's causing the problem, remove her. I'm not saying get rid of her. I'm saying remove her. If you have the ability to do so, remove her to another area, maybe her own little private apartment for a little while, feed her separately, let her do her thing, and then give her a few weeks. Again, I know it's not easy to do that, but it may solve your problem. Give her a few weeks, then reintroduce her. Because what has happened? She's been, the queen bee, if you will, has been taken out of the hive. And now the flock has now reestablished a different order. Now you put her back in and the thing's going to start. And it may not work, but it may, when reintroducing that hen that was aggressive, she could actually become the submissive bird just through that process. So try those few things and assess a few things. And hopefully there are some stuff. I don't necessarily encourage a lot of this because this goes back to what I just said I don't like, but there are some products out there that do. I've seen this work for people before, but it does encourage them to eat too much energy. But the one good thing is these things are formulated with some additional protein in them, but there are some commercially available. You've probably seen them before. I've seen people have success. I've seen other people not have success, but they're called flock blocks. There's different companies that make different ones. They're just a compressed block with some grain, with some usually cottonseed meal, which is a protein source. In there, some vitamins, minerals. So it's somewhat complete. But what it does, it limits the boredom in the flock. So it does cut down on some of those issues with feather pecking sometimes. But before I go that route, I would just suggest assessing everything about your operation. Again, think like that bird. And you may even try, if you can, take that aggressive female out. Or if we're talking about males here, that's a whole different thing. Males fight a lot, period. But if you've got one male with your females and the one male's beating up a lot, that's a whole different dynamic. That'd be where you'd remove the male altogether and go that route. If you're talking all females, you got one female that's beating up everybody and you can't get her under control after you assess everything, I would try, if you can, remove her, put her in a separate quarters for a little while, and then reintroduce her, see if it works.
Awesome. All right. Someone said, any tips to avoid problems adding grown-out baby chicks to a flock of 4 adult Bainums, 1 rooster, 3 hens? My baby chicks come from Sand Hill Thursday.
So if they're asking, what I think they're asking is, they're young birds that they've grown, they've brooded them, and then they want to introduce them to the flock. I think that's probably what they're asking. That's going to be a little challenge. I would not recommend doing that if you can avoid it. And I'm not saying don't ever introduce them. I'm just saying if you can, with what facilities you have, once you've brooded those chicks, in the summer, 3 weeks or so in the brooder should be plenty of time. Then it's warm enough outside. You can put them. If you can set up a small little, maybe a pen of some sort just for those birds you brooded, those babies, let them grow, get us some more weight on those birds. Get them up to, maybe if you can last this long, separated, get them up to about 6 months. When they're young, starting to sexually mature, get them at that age, then introduce them. Because if you introduce birds that are fairly young chicks, if you take birds out of the breeder that 3 weeks old and you introduce them to a flock of mature birds, which I think is what you're asking, that probably sets up something that's going to be more of a problem. In fact, and I don't know your flock, but that certainly could set up problems with the older flocks actually killing some of the babies, because it's easy for them to do so. They just peck them and then it kills them. So I would give the young birds some age first before I introduce them, then introduce them. That way you've put some weight. Females are starting to get a little estrogen. The males are starting to get a little testosterone about that 6 month mark or so, then introduce them, and then they'll establish that order, and you probably won't have as many problems. I would avoid putting young birds in with older birds if you can.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions before we hop off of here?
Good questions.
Yes. I'm glad we're interacting this evening. All right. Well, we thank you so much, Dr. Downs. We super appreciate it, and we hope to see you soon. And thank you, everyone, for hopping on. And look next month for our next topic in July.
War Eagle to Hal. I don't know how, but he's gave me a War Eagle, so I got to give him one back.
Uh-oh.
Thanks again, Kristen. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.